Very good afternoon, everyone. It's just gone 2:30 on Wednesday afternoon, and we're really happy to have you here today for our session on managing the prevalence of risk in aged care. So we are expecting quite a large number of participants today. So we're just going to give a couple of minutes for people to make sure that they're able to get connected appropriately. We will be using the Q&A function today. So if you do have any questions as we go through, please make sure that you use the Q&A function. We won't be monitoring the chat through this session. So again, please, if you do have any questions as we go, the Q&A function is the very best place for those to go. We'll do our best to answer the questions in this session. And if we don't get to them throughout the conversation and as part of the slides, we'll certainly make sure that we provide some feedback if we haven't been able to answer those questions. So again, a really warm welcome. My name's Carla Beharam and Dr. Irene Stein. We're really very much looking forward to spending the next hour and a half with you to run through managing the prevalence of risk in aged care. So we'll just allow 1 or 2 more minutes for some people to join, and we'll be right with you. Okay, Irene, I think in the interest of time, we might actually make us start today. So again, a very warm welcome to everybody, and thanks for taking the time out of what we know is a really busy life in the day of an aged care operator. So we really appreciate your time. Just before we get started, we'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we deliver this session today from, and wherever you may be joining us. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. So thanks again for joining us. We're going to spend the next hour and a half or so running through with you managing the prevalence of risk in aged care, and it's certainly something that we know through our work with our clients. Prevalence of risk and managing the risk is something that continues to be quite challenging for providers on a day-to-day basis. So Irene and I have got a pretty practical session for you, we think, where we're going to try our best to give you some good tools and tricks to take away at the end of this session. Just a little bit about Anchor Excellence. We're a national bespoke aged care consulting firm, and we provide a whole range of services. I'm not going to go into them now. You're very welcome to have a look at our website, but we do work really closely with aged care providers, particularly relevant to today's conversation around risk and compliance. Our mission is absolutely about impacting the leadership and quality of aged care services. And for us, our whole reference is making sure that we're really developing a system that we can be proud of, and one that is absolutely focused on the lived experience of older Australians. Our promise, we know that leadership is always about people, and we're absolutely committed to enabling leaders, whether you might be at the start of your leadership and development career, or else if you've been in the industry for a pretty long time and you're quite seasoned, we're still very passionate about making sure that we're enabling you to do the very best that you can every day. So what are we going to have a look at today? So really this session is focused on enabling you to be familiar with some of the key definitions relating to risk. We're going to connect risk to the aged care quality standards and have a bit of a look at the sector performance report. I know from Irene and my experience, it's a really important document that we do pay a lot of attention to, because it helps us really understand what the focus of the Quality and Safety Commission is. We want to spend just a little bit of time connecting to the compliance and enforcement policy from the Quality and Safety Commission. Irene's going to really link to the Charter of Aged Care Rights and make that connection around risk identification and what you need to be looking for. Be familiar with the risk cycle, and at the end of the session we're going to have a look at one tool that we certainly advocate for, which is our tool, which is a high impact risk assessment. And once you get to the end of this session, you'll be able to see some of the key elements that you need to be looking for that are captured in the HERA E. At the end of this session, just in case there's any questions coming through about slides, the slides will be made available to you at the end of the session. And we'll also be sending some key resources, which is the compliance and enforcement policy, the sector performance data report, and also effective incident management systems. These are all readily available on the Quality and Safety Commission's website, but we will send those through for you for ease of reference. So let's have a look at some key definitions and terminology. And I think it's important, Irene, as we go through these slides, to really acknowledge that we've got a really broad range of people who are on our session today. So while some of this might be information that you know, a lot of it may be actually quite new for new players. So we do want to just set the foundation with some key definitions. It'd be remiss of us not to talk about the definition of risk, given that we're talking about prevalence of risk. And this is really, risk really relates to the chance of something happening that will have a negative impact. And it's measured by likelihood and consequence. And I think if you think about the context of aged care, residential services or home care services, we also think about the impact and the harm. So what kind of harm could potentially be caused to somebody through a risk? Risk management talks about the process of identifying, assessing and controlling the threat and the risk. So what is it that you're doing in your systems to really make sure that you're doing everything you can to control those risks? Risk control, very similar to that of risk management. So it's a set of systems and processes to keep your workplace or your environment, or for your residents or consumers' case, their home, free from harm or the potential for harm. And again, it's that really important concept around it's not only things that have happened, but the potential for them to happen.
That's very much, Carla, the language of the Commission.
Yeah, exactly right.
Potential for harm, they do stress that quite often.
Yeah, exactly. If we think about risk appetite, so if you're typically risk appetite would be something that your senior leaders and your management and your board would be talking about, but it really relates to the level of risk that your organisation is prepared to accept. And it really represents the tension between potential benefit and threat. So this is really about understanding what you're prepared to put up with as a risk, how high your tolerance is, and if you have a low appetite for risk, then what kind of strategies are you putting in place to make sure that that risk isn't out of control? We move on to high impact and high prevalence risk, and these are actually quite specific terms when you think about the aged care quality standards. So these ones are in the context of aged care. And high impact is a risk that can have significant effect on a person's safety, health, or well-being. And again, if we reflect on the quality standards, Irene's going to connect to them shortly, but the whole premise of the quality standards and the Quality and Safety Commission is to support people to have good quality care that provides safety and it focuses on their health and well-being. So that's high impact risk. When we talk about high prevalence risk, it's a large number of people in a particular group that are affected by the same conditional risks. And the obvious one that I'm sure all of you in this session who are in direct operations can really be thinking about is a high prevalence of falls. So in many aged care services, there's strategies around managing the high risks of falls. So falls is a good example of high prevalence. Levels of decision making is a really important definition as well that you need to be across in your organisations and homes. And it's really understanding people's capacity or what level of decision making they have. And the three levels, so actually the four levels that we talk about now are independent decision making. So somebody who can make all of their own decisions without requiring any support. They may have people there advocating for them, but they're actually able to make their own decisions independently. Supported is implying that somebody does need some level of support with some of their decisions. So a good example of that could be, I'm Irene's support person for her care decisions, but all of her financial decisions she can make independently. Substitute decision maker. So this is again where there's a formal agreement in place where somebody is making decisions on behalf of somebody else. And more recently, as of the 1st of, gosh, I'm getting all my dates. It's the 1st of October, thank you. It's around restrictive practice and the substitute decision maker around restrictive practice. So again, some really key definitions there that you need to be across in your own organisations. And then the final definition that we really just want to touch on is open disclosure. And again, really understanding that open disclosure is an open discussion with consumers, their substitute decision maker or other support people, of incidents that have caused harm or have had the potential to cause harm. It involves a regret or apology, a factual explanation about what happened, the potential consequences, remedial steps to manage the situation, and really what you're doing about preventing it. Now, open disclosure is probably a whole nother session on its own, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it is important, again, that when we're talking about prevalence of risk and minimising the risk of incidents occurring again, open disclosure is a really important conversation to be having.
Thanks, Carla. I'm going to pick up the pace here a bit, and we're going to look at the aged care quality standards. Now, at this point, but I'm sure you've already done it, can I advise you to go to your app store on your mobile phone or your device or your tablet, whatever you've got, and download the aged care quality standard app. It's a very simple app, and it just goes through the 3 statements for each of the standards: the consumer statement, the organisational statement, and then the requirements. It's a great teaching tool. You can do on-the-spot education with it, and we actively encourage everybody we come into contact with through these webinars to take advantage of the fact that it does exist. Okay. There's 2 standards in particular that we want to focus on, although I've got to say risk cuts across every single standard. You can't take any of them in isolation, but there are 2 that actually talk directly to high impact, high prevalence risk. The first of those is standard 3.3b. Slide, next slide, please. Right. Now, looking at standard 3.3b, the organisation delivers safe and effective personal care, clinical care, or both personal and clinical care in accordance with the consumer's needs, goals and preferences in order to optimise their health and their well-being. Now, this very much piggybacks on standard 2, where of course risk is also identified when you're planning care for the consumer. Some of the what's expected is that you can effectively manage some of these high impact or high prevalence or both risks associated with the care of every single consumer in your service. Managing hydration and nutrition, and there's been a particular focus in this terms of this area for urinary tract infections in the last couple of weeks from the Commission. Managing the risks of choking. We know that choking is the 2nd highest cause of unwanted death in residential care. Managing medications safely, and we all know the consequences of polypharmacy and poor medication practice. Managing pain effectively. Preventing and managing pressure injuries. Minimising restrictive practice, and of course we're all across the suite of new requirements that came in this year. Managing delirium. Managing hearing loss, and I guess there we should also say vision also, and talk about it in terms of sensory loss, and falls prevention. Now, this is the list that the Commission refers to in its literature. There's no surprises there, but we do know that they consider these to be high-risk areas. For the consumer gets personal care, clinical care, or both personal care and clinical care that is safe and right for me. This is very much a personal statement, and it starts with I get, and it ends with right for me. So the consumer is absolutely central to the fact that we must identify and minimise these risks for compliance.
Irene, just before we move on to the next slide, I just wanted to call 2 things out in particular. I think it's with this standard, it's really important to understand that there's an expectation across the organisation. It's not just up to the clinicians. It's not just up to the board. It's actually across all three levels, board, management and clinicians, to be able to meet this requirement. The other element that I'd call out too, and I think, again, for any of the clinicians or care managers who are out in the services, is if you have a look at this list of high impact and high prevalence, you know that very rarely will any of them stand alone. And so a good example of that would be pain and pressure injuries, or pain and minimizing restrictive practice, or risk of choking and nutrition and hydration. So, you know, there's lots of crossovers when you have a look at these high risks. And again, we know that from the way that the Commission actually complete their assessment contacts, these are always looked at, I guess, in a pattern and together.
Yeah, they tend to triangulate a lot of that data, Carla, just to, I guess, be absolutely certain that all the risks are ticked off and identified.
Yeah.
So there are other risks too that we know of, other than what the Commission has identified. Management of infections, particularly UTIs, to dip or not to dip comes instantly to mind. Management of diabetes, both type 1 and type 2. And complex health care, tracheostomies, suprapubic catheters, indwelling catheters, PEG, feeds and stomas. Now, in the new brave world of ANIC, these are going to have a particular place, and so it's good to pay attention to them in advance. The built environment, we know the built environment can be tricky for people, and we always, when we talk about the built environment, say that living in a residential aged care service does not stop risk for people. If someone's got impulse behaviours, or they want to try to live the way that they would have at home, the same risks are going to apply for that individual. So it comes very much down to knowing your person and knowing their personal risk and their appetite for risk. Social and emotional risk, and this has come, if you have a look at a lot of the reports that have come out in the last 18 months, a lot of this has been to do with the isolation around COVID. And so there's a heightened awareness of those. Third-party service providers and contracts. We know that third-party providers don't always act in the best interests of people. And the thing that springs instantly to my mind, which is a very high clinical risk, is inadequate orientation of agency staff when they come onto your premise. Technology failure in particular can be a risk. Assault, staff on resident, resident on staff, resident on resident, and perhaps resident on other people within the environment. And we know now that that's a SIRS reportable event. Absconding, also a SIRS reportable event. Outbreak, gastro, scabies, influenza, COVID, that comes with a heap of risks. Continence management, new admissions. And now we've put respite up here because we've had some very interesting interaction with respite residents in the last 6 months even, where there's been an assumption that a respite resident doesn't have the same inherent risks as someone who's been admitted as a permanent resident. Let us disabuse you of that right now. Quite often, the risks for somebody on respite are higher than for someone who is on permanent, because the attention to detail in pre-admission and post-admission assessments is not as rigorous as for someone who's going to become permanent. Return from hospital, suicidal ideation, cultural safety, and that's been a particular focus in terms of risk to people, cultural safety from the Commission in the last little while. Rostering for acuity is really important if you want to manage risk. If you don't understand flexing rosters, it's a concept that is really handy in terms of knowing that if you've got in one area a group of sick people, it gives you the capacity to move people to where they're needed to provide care. And power failure. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, and I'm sure you can add many others to the risks that we have in a residential environment and in a community-based environment. When we look further into this standard, there are role accountabilities. There's role accountabilities for management and for clinicians, and across this standard, they are the same. They've got to follow best practice guidance and apply measures to make sure the risk is as low as possible, while supporting a consumer's independence and self-determination to make their own choices. Now, the language that comes here, of course, to mind is dignity of risk, allowing people to have a crack at life and to take a risk if they think that they've got the capacity to manage that risk. For high impact or high prevalent risks, organisations are expected to use risks assessments to find out ways to reduce these risks. Now, you'll notice there is no language here that says that you eradicate risk. It's realistic enough to realise that you can't take all risk out of life. Educate and support workforce to minimise risk to consumers, and manage risk in a way that balances the consumer's rights and preferences with their safety and the safety of others. So there's a very clear mandate there for us to do a lot of risk assessment and to minimise the risk in the environment. The other standard, 8.3D1, about role accountability, is very important in our context. Board and management, effective risk management systems and practices, including but not limiting to managing high impact or high prevalence risks associated with the care of consumers, ensuring there are systems for identifying risks and incidents, minimising and managing risks and responding to incidents to support the safety and the well-being of consumers, and reviewing these systems to ensure that there is constantly improving consumer outcome. So very much going to the heart of your quality cycle. On the clinician level, you have to understand risk, identify and respond to incidents, and to drive continuous improvement. For the consumer, they've got to feel confident the organisation is well run and they partner in improving the delivery of care and services. Incidents and risks are openly disclosed to consumers and their substitute decision makers, and they're involved in the resolution of incidents. And they've got to feel that there is communication about risks that relate specifically to them. Now, this is a very strongly worded standard, and one of the questions that the Commission assessors will constantly ask, of course, is do you feel safe here? Do you think the home is well run? And this goes to the whole risk profile of your organisation. Only last week, I think, Carla, wasn't it? Was it last week or the week before?
Yeah, time flies. I think it was the week before, actually.
Right. The latest Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission sector performance report came out. Now, look, we've included this because the data is really hot, I guess. And even though we recognise now it's November, this has been a fairly timely document in terms of the Commission's usual pace in releasing information. So we just want to take you through some of the highlights of that. So this first, and this is taken directly from that document, which we're going to send out as an additional resource if you haven't had the opportunity to review it already. Across the standards, this is where they found non-compliance. Standard 1, consumer dignity and choice. The outstanding one here, of course, is standard 3, personal care and clinical care. By far and away, that was where non-compliance was found. Coming in second was human resources, followed closely by ongoing assessment and planning with consumers and organisational governance, organisation service environment and feedback and complaints. And then, I found this a bit surprising, but it's a great outcome. The last horse in the race was consumer dignity and choice. So people are starting to get the message that it is consumer-centric, and 100% of the constituents of your service, be it community or be it residential, have to be satisfied with the service they're receiving. The bar is a very high bar to be measured against.
Irene, just before we move on to the next slide, the other thing that I'd call out, really, if you have a look at the top 4 there, I mean, we've talked about standard 3 and standard 8 specifically referencing risk. But standard 2, of course, has risk connected, because it's implying that you're identifying risk through your assessments and your planning. And through standard 7, if you haven't got people who are able to identify or understand risk, there's absolutely that connection there as well.
I think too, Carla, in terms of standard 8, the governing body or the board, whatever it's called in particular organisations, is finally getting the message that they are the ultimate level of responsibility for risk within their organisation. And while they can delegate responsibility, they do remain accountable.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it breaks it down further to where the top 10 requirements where non-compliance was found or identified. 3.3a, safe and effective personal clinical care. 3.3b, high impact or high prevalence risk managed effectively. 7.3a, workforce number and skill mix. 2.3a, safe and effective care and services. 8.3c, effective governance, and 8.3d, risk management systems and practices. 2.3d, communication. 8.3e, clinical governance framework. 5.3b, safe, clean and well-maintained safe service environment. 3.3d, recognition and response to deterioration. Now, we've deliberately circled the ones where people really come unstuck. And if you have a look at the ones we've circled, you'll notice there's a knock-on effect between them all. So if you come unstuck, for example, in 3.3a or 3.3b because of your risk management framework, it's going to knock on to all of these other standards, but in particular standard 8, which we discussed earlier, on 3 levels, okay, and standard 3. So you can see there's 2, 4, 6 not mets. And can I tell you, it will rebound back to standard 2 and standard 1 also. So getting your risk framework correct and effectively used is going to be a great mitigation factor for you all. Again, we've highlighted some of the we haven't, the Commission has, non-compliance with requirements of particularly standard 3 personal and clinical care. Safe and effective personal and clinical care, high impact, end-of-life care, deterioration, information sharing, timely and appropriate referrals, and infection risk management and appropriate prescribing. Now, in relation to 3.3f, we're really good. We are excellent at referring people on for another opinion or to get advice or support in providing care. What we're not good at is actually recording what we do with that information. There may be clear clinical evidence just from the person's well-being that, in fact, the referral pathways have been followed up, but there's no documentation to support it. So a lot of this non-compliance, even though you may be doing the things that's required for a person, if it's not documented, then there can be no assumption that it's been completed. Requirements of the quality standards most frequently cited in a non-compliance notice. Effective and safe personal care, high impact, there it is again. Risk management, there it is again. Review of care and services, because we know that is key to preventing risk, identifying and preventing harm for people or the potential for harm, and safe and effective care and services. So you can see how tight the interrelationship is between these standards and the requirements that have been found not met by Commission auditors. Okay, between April and June, there were just over 1,500 complaints about residential aged care. If we break it down by state, the most populous state, New South Wales, 425 complaints, Victoria, 419, and Queensland, 309. Of those 1,500 complaints, the individual number of issues complained about was 1,184. So you can see that there's a broad spectrum of complaints that are being made. And I went back to some data 12 months ago, and there's been an exponential increase in the number of complaints for a three-month time period. Okay. In July this year, the Commission, in relation to risk and adverse events, critical incidents, SIRS reporting, they released a compliance and enforcement policy, and I think we're sending that out also as a resource.
Yeah.
This is a very dry read, but it's a very important read, because what it's doing, it is now enforcing financial penalties for people that do not comply. The legislative framework for that is the Aged Care Act 1997 and the related principles, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission Act 2018, the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission Rules 2018, and the Crimes Act of 1914. And the whole purpose of them releasing this policy was to enable the Commission to understand, predict, and here we go, reduce risks in the aged care sector. So the compliance and enforcement policy underwrites, if you like, the standards that we talked about, particularly Standard 3 and Standard 8. I'm going to hand over to Carla now because she's going to go through some of the compliance issues related to risk.
Thanks, Irene. And again, this particular figure is available through the document that we're going to send out. But it's for me, what I really like about this, it really clearly identifies how the Commission goes about responding to risk that's been identified through whether it be assessment visits or through ways that they actually monitor organisations and providers. Now, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but I think it's worth highlighting that basically it's using a red, amber, green kind of traffic light system to really indicate as your risk is increasing or as things are starting to become more risky, the amount of actions will increase. And that's clearly indicated down on the right-hand side here. But if you have a look at this, I guess this figure, it's highlighting that the way that the Commission is able to assess you or able to identify issues with performance is through a number of areas. So it might be through compliance monitoring. It may be through your performance assessment reports or your accreditation visits, your monitoring visits. It could be through complaints. So if the Commission's seeing a large number of complaints coming through or systemic issues that are being identified, it may be through prudential assessment, so compliance to prudential requirements, maybe through investigation and talking here through SIRS, reportable incidents also, and consumer feedback and information available from other parties. Now, if we have a look across the top here, again, if we think about our green light, if there's no areas for improvement, the basic monitoring that you're going to be under is really your education and engagement and a risk-based monitoring approach. You're going to receive your 4 stars through the DOT rating system, which was introduced early this year or late last year, which is readily available on My Aged Care. And really, you're just going to be tracking through as a provider with your regular continuous improvement, including your self-assessment. The Commission will continue to engage with you and just monitor your service based on your risk. Now, as you go through this diagram here as well, when we talk about dealing with non-compliance, obviously if things are in the yellow area, the Commission's having a look and identifying that there are some improvements required. As a provider, again, we talk about the risks. Your obligation is to make sure that you're taking prompt actions to manage consumer risks, that you're communicating your findings, that you're revising your plans for continuous improvement. As we start to move down the diagram, and again, we can see the colours changing from yellow through to orange through to red, we can see that there's more actions required. So we can see that there's further regulatory requirements. So you may be issued with an action for undertaking or a remedy, undertaking to remedy. There may be some enforceable compliance action. And when we talk about the actions that the Commission may take, we end up down here when we talk about appointment of advisors, meeting with consumers and representatives, and meeting with providers and boards. So this is really just a quick snapshot of how the Commission may deal with compliance action if there's risk that's been identified through your service. again, this is readily available through the compliance and enforcement policy, and it gives you a little bit more information around that.
Thanks, Carla. We're going to have a quick, just a very high-level overview. The Commission see their role as to protect the public, particularly from people that they see the cohort of people that require both community and residential aged care services as being a vulnerable group. And so their remit is to protect those people, I guess, from the providers of care and services. So the first thing that they do is monitor the compliance of approved providers. Now, this is accreditation, re-accreditation, unannounced visits, and response to complaints. They publish information about non-compliance of performance. And again, this is on the website. It's readily available to people. If you have a poor accreditation visit or re-accreditation visit, it's usually several months before the information is published. By the time you go through you get the notice, you get time to respond, and then the decision maker takes time. So it could be 3 to 4 months before this information is published. You get a notice of direction or a directions notice, which tells you exactly what they expect of you within a given time frame. They require approved providers to produce documents or further information in order to make a decision or a determination on the outcome of a compliance matter. You may be issued with an undertaking to remedy non-compliance, and that's a more formal approach where you've got a very rigid timeline in order to produce evidence that you have met the undertaking that's been determined by the Commission in relation to your care and service provision. Accepting and enforcing enforceable undertakings on providers. In other words, there's hyper-vigilance about how you're managing your service and whether you are doing exactly what the Commission has asked you to do. A notice to act, again, it's another level, a higher level of compliance expected, where you're given notice to take a particular action. And if you don't, there'll be an infringement notice issued. The infringement notice carries a monetary penalty. It's measured in units, and we're going to come to that a bit later, so you get a better understanding of that. Under the new rules and regulations, they can apply to a court for an injunction or to get an order to enforce a civil penalty against you. Now, can I just stress here, a civil penalty is not a criminal penalty. A sanction notice, we all know about sanction notices, and they can, if all else fails, suspend or revoke the licence or approval for an approved provider to provide care and services at a community or at a residential aged care level.
Irene, I think it's worth just pointing out here, and again, this is quite clear in some of the Commission's documents around the way they enforce compliance. If a provider can demonstrate that they're willing to, willing and able to comply with compliance action, the compliance action from the Commission will be quite different compared to a provider that may not necessarily demonstrate or fail to actually or deliberately avoid compliance action. So again, I think that the key message here really is understanding what you're being asked to do and really making sure that if you've committed to an undertaking, that you're following every single action that you've committed to. That'll be much more appropriately received through the Commission than if you're deliberately avoiding, the undertaking that you've signed up to.
Yeah, sure, Carla. I mean, the whole thing is about how the Commission reacts to a particular service's risk level and how that service engages in the ongoing monitoring process. I just wanted to spend a couple of moments, please, looking at the infringement notice for identified risk, because this is very, very new. The Commission may issue an infringement notice within 12 months, which is quite a long time frame, after the day on which the alleged contravention occurred. Now, this gives the Commission time to go through that hierarchy of interventions and finally get to the point where they perhaps feel there's no alternative but to issue an infringement notice. So the 12 months would be well within that rubric. The approved provider may pay the amount specified in the notice, or alternatively, they can challenge it in court and seek to have it set aside if they feel they've got robust evidence enough to do that and to challenge the risks that have been identified. It may be used for isolated or non-systemic contraventions where there's no immediate or severe risk of harm to consumers and where issuing the infringement notice is likely to result in positive change. So there's a kind of hedge your bets statement there. The penalty system applies. Now, each unit currently, and it is indexed, it's regularly indexed, is $222 per unit. So 60 units is $132,000. No, $13,200, sorry. And this is, for example, that would apply, the 60 units would apply to failure to comply with restrictive practices compliance notice. Okay, so they've isolated and identified a whole heap of things, which you can see on there in this document, that attract a financial penalty and it may even escalate from there to a civil penalty. But again, civil penalties are not criminal matters. So how does this connect to the Charter of Aged Care Rights? There's 3 statements in particular that relate to risk. I have the right to safe and high quality care and services. I make the choice about those as the subtext here, and that's really highlighted in number 7, have control over and make choices about my care and personal and social life, including where the choices involve personal risk. Again, that language is dignity of risk. And I have the right to my independence. So independence, of course, infers risk. And because it infers risk, you have to have a risk management framework to manage those things. There are many elements that form a clinical risk framework, and the accountability for this rests squarely with the organisation's governing body. Going back to a previous comment I made, you can delegate, but you still are responsible and accountable. Some of the things that this risk framework includes, and look, again, this is not an exhaustive list, and depending on the nature of your service, you might have all of these things, you might have some of these things, and you may have some other things that you feel make up your robust risk framework. So firstly, clinical and organisational governance frameworks. This is very heavily embedded in all the standards. Particularly standard 8, in fact, all of them. You can't take it out of any of those standards. Policy and processes with relevant forms, again, with a focus on reducing risk. Risk assessments, can't stress how important these are, not only clinically, but environmentally. For example, if you're ripping up lino in a particular area, a thorough risk assessment of how that's going to impact everything down to the smell of the glue needs to be included to mitigate risk for your consumers. Your risk appetite statement, and Carla gave you quite a simple definition of that earlier. Your risk register, clinical and organisational, and that's something that the Commission will ask to see. Your third-party contract arrangements, and we talked briefly about that earlier, and I've mentioned agency staff, but we've got other third-party contractors now that have become very much part of the landscape. It might be catering, it might be cleaning, it might be laundry, it could be physio, podiatry. There's quite a number of those third-party contractors now that provide a lot of basic care and services for residents and for other consumers. Critical incident reporting and SIRS. We know that the SIRS requirements now, priority 2 has taken hold, and critical incident reporting is the methodology behind that has to be very, very, I guess, crystal clear and very transparent for the end user. Risk management and the Work Health and Safety Committee structure and their terms of reference. Your Medication Advisory Committee, this connects to clinical risk. particularly in the area of antimicrobial stewardship and deprescribing of psychotropic medication. Audit schedules, in particular, any of the audits that relate to high impact and high prevalence risk. Staffing sufficiency, going very much to the heart of Standard 7, the skills and knowledge and the application of these trays in your staffing, and your ability, I guess, to target recruit if you know you've got a particular cohort of residents that are going to have ongoing needs that your current staffing can't meet. The risk-based questions, and we're going to look at those shortly. These are the risk-based questions that the Commission will go through in the first hour of any contact visits, and creating a no-blame environment. If you want people to be forthright about risk and things that they've seen or might have been involved in, it's very important that they don't feel that they're going to be personally attacked or blamed if they bring something to your attention. I'm going to hand back to Carla now, and she's going to go through some of the risk cycle with you.
Yeah, thanks, Irene. So we're going to spend a little bit of time, as Irene said, on the risk cycle, and rather than just regurgitating information at you, we've made a bit of a case study where we're going to talk to each of these points. But if we do have a look at the risk cycle, there's a couple of key elements that we know we would typically expect to see in a risk cycle. So the first one being identifying risk, the second, analysing the risk, so really trying to understand what this risk is telling you, evaluating the risk and ranking it, and this is where we would connect to risk appetite, so really saying, well, it's an extreme risk, I'm not really prepared to tolerate that. Respond to the risk, so what is it that we're actually doing about the risks that we've identified? Monitoring and review, so how often are we checking this? What's our mechanism for making sure that we've got the risk controlled? And then repeat, so basically going back and identifying the risk again, analysing, evaluating, responding, monitoring and review. So as I said, let's have a look at a case study, and Irene and I were really talking about this for us. This was a really interesting scenario that we helped a provider with. So let's set the scene here. We've got Mrs. James, who is a 65-year-old woman with motor neurons disease, who came to the service for respite care with a view for permanent residence. Following admission, there were a number of systemic failures related to her care and service provision. Her motor neurons disease was advanced and Mrs. James was nil by mouth. She had a PEG feed and her respiration was BiPAP supported. So if there's any non-clinicians, this is basically a breathing apparatus to help people with their breathing. Mrs. James had no verbal communication, but she had no cognitive deficit, and she communicated via an electronic whiteboard and via text message. So she was very much able to articulate, anything that was going on for her, but it was all via electronic whiteboard and via text message. Her BiPAP machine was externally monitored for functionality. So it went to the respiratory company, and then it came back to her supported decision maker. So if we have a look at actually the risks as part of this case conference. So for Mrs. James, we know her advanced motor neurons disease would absolutely have been affecting her motor neurons and her muscles. So in time, she would have experienced significant muscle weakness. She had very clinically complex care needs. So if you think about her PEG machine, her BiPAP machine, the motor neurons disease, all very clinical complex care needs. When we had a look at this particular issue, the risks that should have been identified at pre-admission weren't. So there was a poor pre-admission assessment in relation to the staff knowledge and skills. And as Irene talked about, if you really connect to Standard 7, we want to make sure that people have the skills and knowledge and competence to be able to appropriately provide care and service for these really high risk and clinically challenging care needs. There was no cognitive deficit. But there was an absolute risk that she was non-verbal in her communication. So if staff weren't clear on that's how she communicated, there was absolutely a risk that they may have unintentionally ignored her if she was providing them with information. She was nil by mouth. Again, her BiPAP regime was really complex, and the external monitoring factor was something that should have been identified pre-admission, but it wasn't. There was a very complex medical history with acute deterioration, and that was identified through the NSAF and her discharge summary. She had an extended hospital stay prior to coming to the aged care service. In this instance, she was on some new medications. They were trial medications, and there was a real lack of understanding of the staff on site around the regime and administration. She did have some advanced care directives. She had a not for resuscitation order. And one of the risks were for this particular person, there were no risk assessments completed.
We went on to analyse the risk, and when we looked at the likelihood and the consequence of all her clinical risk factors, we escalated these fairly quickly to get support on site for everybody. One of the things that was particularly, I guess, central to the care that wasn't given, or was given, both, was the lack of a pre-assessment assessment. Nobody really checked out the complexity of need that this particular resident would exhibit, or the inability of the staff to have the skills to match it. There was a perfect mismatch between the admission and the skill set of the staff. And it wasn't until there was significant and quite rapid deterioration that this became, acutely evident. There was a clear underestimation of her cognitive ability and her level of decision-making. Because she was not verbal, there was an assumption that she could not make decisions. Her methodology related to communication was very clear. She had an electronic board and she used her phone for texting. This worked really well until, of course, her acute deterioration. The staff lacked a lot of capability in relation to managing the PEG feeds and the BiPAP machinery. Now, whilst this is complex clinical care, had the risk assessments identified this, the admission probably would not have proceeded. We went on then to evaluate or to rank the risk. And clearly the early identification that was required did not take place. Her care journey was totally compromised and was mismanaged. And there were no risk mitigation strategies identified or implemented until, again, the acute deterioration phase. Staff didn't understand MSD or the complexity or suddenness of her deterioration. That is a bit of a typo, I think. Yeah. There was ambiguity about the staff's knowledge of her NFR order, resulting in active CPR against her wishes when the acute deterioration phase did occur. Had they carried out something as simple as this risk matrix against all the clinical factors, the staffing profile for her would have been very different. Mm-hmm. Her care and services plan would have been very different, and the support services that was required to actively and effectively manage her care would also have been very, very different. This is just a risk matrix that lines up likelihood and consequence, which of course is the language of the Commission. So in response to the risk, complete compliance requirements were undertaken, SIRs were submitted, and there was open disclosure, and the Complaints Commission became involved. This initiated a complete clinical review, care and service plan update, case conferencing multiple times with a substitute decision maker. There was an overall policy and procedure review around complex care delivery and the needs of complex care recipients. A very robust education program was implemented with a competency framework. Escalation pathways were more clearly defined, and a rostering review was undertaken in order to ensure it did not happen again.
Irene, just before we go on to the next slide, I think this is, I guess for the people on the session, this is a really critical point where you want to make sure, we acknowledge that things go wrong in services, and this is part of open disclosure and continuous improvement. But you really want to make sure that the response to these critical incidents is actually really robust, because this is going to be the real key that stops or prevents things from reoccurring again, and particularly calling out the policy and procedure review. So in this particular instance, there were multiple policies and procedures that needed to be reviewed. There was obviously the pre-admission process, but then also having a look at things like escalation of critical emergencies, your handover process, how information is articulated. So how do we make sure that the staff would have been clear about Mrs. James's not for resus request or her advanced care plan? How do we make sure that we've got policies and procedures around complex clinical care management? So again, really the response part is probably the most important thing. Once something has gone wrong, we can't always control everything, but what is it that you're doing about really making sure it doesn't happen again?
Thanks, Carla. We then had a very close look at how to monitor and review the risks that this particular resident faced. And Carla's just talked about the pre-admission risk assessment, and that really should have been a high impact risk assessment. What were the attributes of this particular resident that would have fitted into the high impact, high prevalence risk categories? Preparatory education for staff. Under normal circumstances, there would be no reason not to admit somebody like this resident if the preparatory education had taken place, the competency assessments had been completed, and there'd been adequate time to prepare. The roster could have reflected the acuity that was required of this particular resident and the skills and knowledge of the staff that were needed to meet that acuity. Agency staff provided care, and they did not have the skills or knowledge or I guess the engagement to actually provide continuity of care. Case conferencing and regular reviews between both the resident and their support decision maker should have been in place and were put in place and well monitored. Open discussion regarding end-of-life pathways and preferences was not engaged with, but was subsequently engaged with. Open disclosure and the complaints management process. This was actively engaged with. However, we still did not get enough information from the family or from the admitting service in order for us to adequately prepare. Off-site BiPAP monitoring raised red flags. However, whilst these were ignored, there was a time lag in the time frame because they weren't monitored overnight, and they were monitored between 9 to 5 on a weekday. Some of the out of the flag indicators occurred at night and on weekends, so there was a time lag in actually getting information. Oral medications. At one stage, an agency nurse offered oral medications. However, Mrs. James had the presence of mind to say no, and the clinical documentation was not sufficient to support the care that was actually given to Mrs. James. So it's over to you now, Carla, for a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Irene. And just, I guess, just one other comment to make. I know that if I reflect on my time in residential care, in operations, and certainly managing services, and we know that there's that tension around occupancy and trying to, dealing with vacant beds. But in this particular instance, Irene kind of said that the admission may or should not have happened. But with the right assessment and the right preparation, you know, and again, we understand that tension. You can take most admissions and you can provide most care that fit into this kind of rubric that we've just talked about.
And I think also, Carla, it's interesting for staff, and it maintains staff engagement if there is some complexity around a resident's profile.
Yeah.
It engages them to actually learn more and to teach others also in the environment. And what you rightly say is, if the preparation is sound, there's few limitations really on what a residential aged care service can provide.
Yeah, and if you flip it, you can actually make it a bit of a specialty for your service, where maybe you become the place that does deal with PEG feeds, or you become the service that is actually known for managing dialysis. So there is an opportunity there. Anyway, let's keep going. So a bit of a reflection for you guys, and really thinking about in your own organisations, how do you go about identifying risks? So through observation. So how are you identifying risks through observations? How active are you as a clinician, as a member of the management team, as someone who's part of the quality team? How active are you in identifying risks through your observation? And what do you actually do with these things if you are out in the service and you see something that could be a risk? How are you engaging with your audits to identify risk? And we know that every aged care provider does some kind of audit. It's part of your quality system. You might be using moving on audits. You might be using QPS, whatever. You might be using your own internal audit system. But how are you using those audits to identify your risk? And again, if you think about the risk cycle, what are you doing about to minimise the risks identified there, and then monitoring? How are you using your incidents to actually identify your risk? And it might sound like a really obvious thing to say, well, obviously, if we've got 4 incident forms then about falls, then we've got some high-risk falls. But really tapping into your incident reviews to see, are there any emerging risks that are happening, or are we seeing a pattern of risks that we maybe didn't have 3 months ago? Does that then connect to our consumer profile or our resident profile to say, gosh, 3 months ago, we didn't have any falls, but now we have falls being as an emerging risk for us. So what do we need to be doing, connecting back to staffing, connecting back to education, connecting back to your environment? We also know that consumer feedback is a really important source of identifying risks. It's not just about complaints. It's about really listening to what your consumers are telling you about what their lived experience is like. A good example is around the environmental risks. So if you've got residents who are in your service, for example, and they're identifying that there's some trip hazards around the place, that could then identify an opportunity for your physio team, an opportunity for your maintenance team to do a bit of a review to make sure that those risks have been minimised once they've been identified. So one of my favourite things, and I guess if anyone's had any contact with us for as a support to your organisation, that we really want to help providers understand the risk-based questions from the Commission. Now, again, we know that all of you would have seen these at some point in time, but it's important to really highlight for you that this is how the Commission go about understanding risk that is happening in your service. When they come to do their assessment visits, they will always start with the risk-based questions. And again, these are readily available for you to access. They have changed recently. So we know on the 14th of October, they've been reviewed, rightly so, to reflect the new changes around restrictive practice. But let's have a look at some of these questions. So have there been any adverse findings by another regulatory agency over the last 12 months? What are your trends? What trends do your complaints data show you? So again, you really want to be able to speak to trends, not just numbers. And your trends should be then identifying for you, well, is this raising some new risk in our service? We connect to standard 3B here, high impact and high prevalence risk around managing pressure injuries. So the specific question is, how many consumers are receiving pressure area care? And we know through entry meetings that we've been a part of, there's a question around who's receiving second hourly and fourth hourly care, and a breakdown of the pressure injuries. So you do need to be really across your stage 1 through to unstageable pressure injuries and the names of the consumers. Have there been any medication incidents in the past 6 months requiring hospitalisation or medical attention? How many consumers have had falls and required medical attention in the past 3 months? How many consumers at your service are currently receiving restrictive practices? And if you're not already, you really need to be having a register or some way of easily tracking who is subject to restrictive practice. Describe incidents in the past 6 months where a consumer has required or staff member has required medical attention and in relation to challenging behaviour from another consumer. So again, we're specifically thinking about SEARS. Was a behaviour management plan implemented? And what action has your service taken to assess and minimise infection-related risks, particularly in relation to COVID-19? Irene, we often talk about the fact that the importance of actually using this as a bit of your own audit tool, because this will really identify for you at a very, at a very quick glance, who are your high-risk residents. For all of your residents who are appearing on, I guess, in your risk-based questions, there would absolutely be a greater amount of scrutiny that you would be giving to these residents and the particular care and services that they might need. It might result in more frequent care plan monitoring, more frequent case conferencing, but really, for me, this is the guide as to tell me, well, who are the people who I should be most worried about in my service?
Yeah, I look at, and also if you compile it, just write a list of those names.
Yeah.
You could bet your bottom dollar that they're the ones that the Commission will pick to do the file reviews and to speak to, or to speak to their substitute decision maker.
Yeah. So again, we know that this is, something that everybody is aware of, but I'd really encourage you to become intimately familiar with it, because it's not only for when the Commission arrives, it's actually your way of getting a really good sense of how you can keep your risks really under control and know what they are to start with.
Yeah, it's a good sort of tool to use at meetings with registered nurses in particular. Should the Commission turn up out of hours. So that they're familiar with it, but also it's a reminder to everybody of the people that really should be assessed for risk, and we should be focusing on them in terms of risk mitigation.
Yeah. So we know that there's a slightly different set of questions for home care providers, but again, the same focus is absolutely around your trends. What's your trends complaints data showing you? We're talking about unfilled shifts in the last month, and I think, Irene, it'd be fair to say with everything that's been happening with COVID, there has been a significant number of unfilled shifts in the home care space, difficulty providing staff.
Absolutely, yep.
Yeah. Questioning, does the service have specific strategies to provide care for people living with dementia? And again, connecting to risk, how does the service identify and respond to changes in condition of consumers? And again, your question around COVID-19.
But we're going to look now quickly at managing risk. And most services, because it's a regulatory obligation, have got a suite of risk assessment tools. Many of these are disparate, and there's not very many tools that actually look at the complete whole. Recent changes in the compliance landscape have reinforced the imperative for a comprehensive clinical risk assessment tool that can be used in a variety of environments. And some of these environments are pre-admission assessments, on admission, post-admission review at 6 weeks, as things change for the person, stimulus material for case conferencing, board reporting, excuse me, informing your self-assessment and your PCI, mitigating SIRS reports, minimising restrictive practice, defining the risk profile of your service overall. And one such tool is the HERA-E, or the high impact risk assessment for elders. And it's our belief that this tool brings together the whole risk profile for your service. So I'm going to hand over to Carla. She's going to have a quick review of what the HERA does.
Thanks, Irene. So as we said at the start, there's a number of risk assessment tools that can be used to identify risk. But for us, we've developed our own tool, and we've developed this based on our experience over the last 3 years in all of our compliance work and really understanding where providers have come unstuck in terms of their assessment visits, and more importantly, in the way that they've been providing care and service. So we've developed the HERA-E, the high impact risk assessment tool for elders, and it can be used in residential care services and in home care services alike. So it's an online assessment and it's a clinical governance solution. I'm not going to log into the portal today, but absolutely, if you would like to have a demo after, we'd be more than happy to organise that for you. It's an online platform and it does deliver an end-to-end clinical governance solution. So we talked about the fact over the last hour and a half, we've really talked about the importance of having transparency and being able to demonstrate not only at a frontline perspective, but at a board and governance perspective, how you're really minimising high impact and high prevalence risk. The HERA-E itself, it preemptively identifies high impact risks for your consumers. It supports your care team to understand and minimise and monitor individual and community high impact risk. It significantly reduces your risk of compliance at an accreditation and assessment level. And we know that for our clients who do use this solution, they actually have been able to demonstrate that they've met the requirement standard 3B. It provides transparency that informs board level management and your clinical team. So again, there's in the platform, there is some dashboard reporting that you can really draw some good reports and some good conclusions around what's happening at this point in time with your risks, and it absolutely minimises your cost of care governance. So the benefits of the HERA-E itself, it aligns to a dignity of risk approach and choice by the consumer. So it's specifically asking questions around, levels of independence, and it's supporting people to take risk. By identifying the fact that there's a risk there, it helps providers to be able to say, well, we know the risk exists. Let's have a look at how we go about care planning for this person to make sure that we've really thought about what's important to them, but also the risks that are involved. It's proactive care and support, and it aligns to improving health outcomes for the consumers. It's a quick identification of high impact risks for individuals and communities. There's an improved understanding of likelihood and consequence, and there's capability to manage the risk accordingly. Now, what I didn't say at the start, it's not designed to replace any electronic care systems that are in place. It's not designed to replace all of your care plans and assessments. It's a discrete assessment tool. And I think the best way would probably be to describe it a little bit like you would do a FRAT as a falls risk assessment, a bit like you would do maybe, what's another assessment, Irene, a Braden for pressure injuries. It's really a high impact risk assessment that's looking at what could potentially be causing harm to people. The benefits from a governance and compliance point of view, there's some dashboard and benchmarking reporting and functionality. So there's some very clear graphs, which I'm going to show you, which you can escalate quite easily to your board and even at a local management level to really say, well, what is my risk at this point in time? It can help you understand training and development requirements from your workforce. And to Irene's point, if you know that you've got a particular prevalence of risk in peg feeds, for example, you know that that's an area that you need to focus on a little bit more regularly. It can absolutely support your workforce modelling and human resourcing. So within the tool itself, you can drill down to each community and individual level. So if your teams are coming to you and saying, gosh, I'm really busy in this particular, I don't know, in Waratah wing, you can drill down using the HERA-E to understand, well, what is it that it's telling me about the community who's living in that area? It's also evidence-based. So it's evidence-based data to inform your decisions, making sure that you've got the right systems and policies in place. So again, if you think about when we were talking about risk management and making sure that we've got strategies in place, reviewing your policies and processes is a key component of that. From an operational point of view, we know that people are busy, so we've specifically designed it to be quick and easy to implement. There's a comprehensive onboarding process. There's a help desk available, and again, we've really, I guess, invested a lot of time in our testing to make sure that it's user-friendly and intuitive. We know at the direct care level, typically the assessment is completed by registered nurses. Registered nurses are very busy, and depending on their level of experience or how long they've been in the workforce, levels of computer literacy may not be super high. So we've made it really easy, a really intuitive interface and easy to use. So a couple of the things that we just wanted to show you out of the HERA-E dashboard. And again, if you would like a more comprehensive demo, we'd be really happy to organise that for you. With the HERA-E, you're able to create some dashboards where we talk about residents with significant risk. So once an assessment is completed, it actually gives you the opportunity to say, well, Kimberly Fisher is my highest risk with 42 risks identified. The HERA-E assessment itself actually goes through 60 risk features. And as we talked about, we know that the Commission has their risk factors, but from our experience, we absolutely know that there's far more than that. And we've developed 60 features that we think contribute to significant harm. So you get a list of top 10, and you also get your total sum. And the reason that we think this is really important is because sometimes, so for example, if we have a look at Belinda Jones, she might only be identifying as having 9 risks. But if we know that actually Belinda's had a couple of falls in the last few days, I'm going to redo her assessment because something's changing for Belinda, and I think that her risk is actually increasing. We also, through the system as well, we also provide a prevalence of risk for consumers. So again, at a really quick level, you can get a very good sense of what's happening in your service. So for this particular facility, we can see that their highest risk is social group connections. There may be some pastoral care risks, self-medication. We've got a lot of people who self-medicate. We've got a lot of people who are on anticoagulant therapy. So for me as the facility manager, I would absolutely be investing my time here to say, well, let's make sure that we've got all of our people really skilled on how to manage anticoagulant therapy. Have we got competencies in place for self-medication administration? How are we making sure that our lifestyle program is meeting the needs of our current residents? Another one of the prevalence of another dashboard that the HERA-E can produce for you is that you can drill down to a specific site level. So you can see here I've drilled down to ACE community, and you can see that the risks are slightly different here. We can see that pressure injuries are the highest risk, pastoral care, pain management, and anticoagulant therapy. So when we talked about tailoring our workforce, we can actually say, well, in ACE community, we've got more people who have got pressure injuries. So perhaps I actually need to have a registered nurse for half a shift to support with some of the wound management. So if I'm reviewing this on a regular basis, I could actually say, well, that was the status last month. Right now, there isn't, pressure injuries have moved a little bit further up the chain, further down the chain, sorry, so there may not be that requirement there. So there is some functionality where you can chop and change between the communities and really drill down. You can also drill down at an individual level. So really to see what's happening for each individual person. If what's we haven't put here, but we'd be really happy to show you through the demo, is through the HERA-E, you can actually, it produces a clinical risk register for you. So for all of the assessments that you complete, it populates into an Excel spreadsheet that at an operations level, you can actually really easily manipulate to say, well, let me have a look at who are all my choking risks, who are all my people who have been identified as high falls risk, who are all of my people who are on anticoagulants, what sort of chronic infection, who are the people that I'm supporting with chronic infections. So there is a clinical risk register that is generated through the HERA-E. So I've just stopped sharing my screen there for now, and I'm just going to pause to check if there's any questions. Irene, I think some minor miracles occurred. We've actually finished a couple of minutes early, which is unlike us, but yeah, we'd be very happy to take some questions if there's any that come through the Q&A function. Looks like there's nothing coming through at this point.
Well, there's always the option, Carla, for people to email us
Yep.
or to call the office and ask for a return call.
Yeah.
If you want to talk about any aspects of the presentation,
Yeah.
we're happy to clarify any of the material that we've presented if you need be. But the slide deck will be sent to you at the conclusion of this session.
Yeah.
When you've had a chance to have a look at it and to use it with your staff, perhaps as a teaching tool. Please feel free to give us a call, and if we can provide any clarity or any further support, just let us know.
Of course, if you would like to have a demo of the HERA-E, we'll make sure that there is some information that's sent through with the slides, and we'd be happy to book a demo for you and talk about how this would look in your own organisations. So thanks very much, everyone, for your time.
Hang on, I think we've got a question here. Oh, okay. Right. Okay, thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Yeah, so we've got a really, so we'd love to hear from you. If you'd like to book a demo, or if you've got any questions, please feel free to give us a call. So have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much.
Okay, bye-bye. Stay safe.